Most people don't consciously choose a life that feels heavy, limited, or disconnected. They don't wake up one day and decide to feel stuck, exhausted, or strangely absent from their own existence. And yet, this is exactly how so many people experience their lives, even when everything on the outside seems fine. They have a job, a routine, responsibilities, people who rely on them, and from the outside it looks like they're functioning, coping, doing what needs to be done. But internally there is often a quiet, persistent sense that something is off, as if life is happening around them rather than through them, as if they're present but not fully alive. What makes this feeling so painful is not only the stuckness itself, but the confusion that comes with it. People tell themselves they should be grateful, that others have it worse, that nothing is really wrong. And yet there is this persistent inner tension, this subtle numbness, this feeling of being on hold. They start to question themselves, wondering whether they are lazy, unmotivated, broken, or incapable of making decisions the way others seem to do so easily. They think they know what they want, or at least that they want something different, but every time they try to move toward change, they feel exhausted, overwhelmed, or frozen before they even begin. What most people don't realize is that feeling stuck is rarely the result of failing to choose. Much more often, it is the result of having already chosen, just not consciously, and not from a place of freedom. The most important choices in our lives are rarely made with clarity, intention, or long-term vision. They are made silently, in moments where safety mattered more than truth, where belonging mattered more than authenticity, and where survival mattered more than fulfillment. You didn't choose your life with your rational mind, weighing options and imagining futures. You chose it with your nervous system, responding to what felt safe, acceptable, and least threatening at the time. This is something depth psychology has understood for a long time, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, who emphasized that much of our life is shaped by unconscious patterns rather than conscious decisions. Jung famously said that what we do not make conscious, we will live out as fate. And for many people, what they experience as being stuck is actually the result of living out an old adaptation that once made perfect sense. At some point in your life, you learned how to survive emotionally, relationally, or psychologically, and the structure of your current life is often built around that lesson. For many people, this lesson sounded something like this. Staying quiet is safer than speaking up. Adapting is safer than being authentic. Not needing too much is safer than risking rejection, and being strong is safer than being vulnerable. These are not flaws or weaknesses. They are intelligent responses to environments where safety, love, or acceptance felt conditional. Your system learned how to keep you connected, protected, and intact, even if that meant suppressing parts of yourself, narrowing your desires, or choosing predictability over aliveness. The problem is not that these adaptations exist, but that they don't automatically disappear when life changes. You may no longer be in the situation that required you to shrink, adapt, or endure, but your body doesn't know that yet. The nervous system is not oriented toward happiness or fulfillment. It is oriented toward survival. Once it has learned that certain movements, expressions, or choices are dangerous, it will continue to inhibit them long after the original threat is gone. This is why people often feel an intense internal resistance when they think about changing their life, even when the change they desire is objectively positive. What once protected you can later become the very thing that confines you. And this is one of the most painful paradoxes of psychological growth. The life you are living now may feel small, limiting, or misaligned, but at some point it served a crucial purpose. It kept you safe, connected, or emotionally intact in a situation where alternatives felt too risky. Your system remembers that, even if your conscious mind doesn't, and so it responds to the idea of change not with excitement, but with exhaustion, anxiety, or complete shutdown. This is why so many people say they want more, but feel incapable of moving toward it. It's not because they lack desire or clarity, but because their system associates choice with loss. Loss of approval, loss of stability, loss of identity, or loss of love. The fear is not abstract or intellectual. It lives in the body, shaping sensations, impulses, and limitations long before a conscious thought appears. This is what we refer to as the freeze state, a state that is deeply misunderstood and often misjudged. Freeze is not laziness, indifference, or lack of willpower. Freeze emerges when fighting didn't feel safe and escaping wasn't possible, leaving stillness as the only viable option. It is a highly intelligent response to situations where movement felt too costly, and once learned, it can persist for years or even decades. Later in life, this freeze can manifest as indecision, chronic fatigue, procrastination, emotional numbness, or the sense of being disconnected from one's own desires. But underneath all of these experiences, there is often a deeply loyal part of you that learned one simple rule. If I don't move, I won't lose what little safety I have. So when people say they know what they want, but can't seem to choose it, what they are often really saying is that their system doesn't feel safe enough yet to risk movement. No amount of motivation, discipline, or positive thinking can override a nervous system that still believes it is under threat. This is why simplistic advice about just choosing yourself often fails, especially for sensitive people. It ignores the reality that for some, choosing themselves once meant being alone, being rejected, or being punished for their needs. If your life feels stuck, the question is not what is wrong with you, but what this life once protected you from. Because even if your current life feels limiting or empty, it once made sense. And until that is acknowledged, your system will continue to resist change. In the next part, we will explore why recognizing this truth is not discouraging, but deeply liberating, and how understanding the protective function of your current life is the first step toward choosing differently, not from fear, but from safety. One of the most difficult things to accept when your life feels stuck is that the problem is not a lack of desire, clarity, or intelligence, but a deep and often invisible attachment to the life you are already living. Even when that life feels limiting or misaligned, it has become familiar, predictable, and internally organized in a way that your system understands. And familiarity, for the nervous system, often feels safer than possibility, even when that possibility promises more freedom or fulfillment. What many people don't realize is that they are not just attached to circumstances, routines, or roles, but to an identity that formed around survival. Over time, the choices you made to stay safe didn't just shape your behavior, they shaped your sense of who you are. You didn't simply learn how to cope. You learned how to exist in a way that minimized risk, disappointment, or emotional pain. And that version of you became familiar, reliable, and deeply embedded in your sense of self. This is why change often feels threatening on a level that is hard to explain logically. It's not just about losing a job, a relationship, or a lifestyle. It's about losing a version of yourself that once knew how to survive. Even if that version is exhausted, constrained, or quietly unhappy, it carries a sense of identity and continuity. Letting go of it can feel like stepping into emptiness, like erasing a map without yet having a new one. And for the nervous system, that can feel more dangerous than staying where you are. Many people believe they are afraid of failure, but very often they are afraid of disorientation. They are afraid of not knowing who they will be if they no longer play the role of the one who adapts, endures, carries, or holds everything together. The question that lingers underneath their resistance is rarely, "What if I fail?" but rather, "Who will I be if I stop surviving this way?" And that question has no immediate answer, which is precisely why the system resists moving forward. There is also a quiet grief embedded in this process that often goes unrecognized. When you begin to sense that the life you are living no longer fits, you are not only confronting the future, but also the past. You are coming face to face with the realization that you shaped your life around what was necessary rather than what was true, and that realization can carry sadness, anger, or a sense of lost time. Many people unconsciously avoid change because it would force them to acknowledge how much they adapted, how much they gave up, and how long they lived in a way that wasn't fully aligned with themselves. Staying stuck can therefore serve another function. It allows you to postpone grief. As long as nothing changes, you don't have to fully feel what it cost you to survive the way you did. Movement threatens to open not only new possibilities, but also old emotions that were never fully processed. This is one of the reasons why people often feel emotionally overwhelmed when they begin to consider change, even before taking any concrete steps. The system senses that movement might unlock feelings that were kept at bay for a long time, and it responds by slowing everything down. Another layer that makes choosing differently so difficult is loyalty. Many people are unconsciously loyal to the systems, families, or relational dynamics they grew up in, even when those environments were restrictive or painful. Choosing a different life can feel like a betrayal, as if stepping into more freedom, ease, or fulfillment would somehow invalidate the suffering that came before or distance them from the people they once needed to belong to. This loyalty doesn't always make sense rationally, but emotionally it can be incredibly powerful, creating a subtle inner conflict between growth and belonging. So when people say they feel torn, ambivalent, or paralyzed, it's often because multiple parts of them want different things. One part longs for expansion, truth, and aliveness, while another part is desperately trying to preserve connection, safety, and continuity. Without understanding this inner conflict, people often judge themselves harshly, interpreting their hesitation as weakness or self-sabotage, when in reality, it is the expression of a system trying to protect itself from perceived loss. This is also why willpower alone is rarely enough to create real change. Willpower operates on a conscious level, while the forces that keep you stuck operate far deeper, shaping impulses, sensations, and emotional responses long before a decision reaches awareness. Trying to force yourself into a new life without addressing these deeper layers often leads to burnout, collapse, or a return to familiar patterns, reinforcing the belief that change is impossible. What's crucial to understand here is that your resistance is not an enemy. It is not something to overcome, eliminate, or fight against. Resistance carries information. It tells a story about what once felt dangerous, what once mattered, and what your system learned it had to do to survive. When you approach resistance with curiosity rather than judgment, it begins to soften, because it no longer has to work so hard to protect you from being misunderstood or pushed beyond what feels safe. The goal is not to suddenly abandon the life you're living, but to understand it, to see it clearly for what it is and what it was, without romanticizing it or condemning it. When you recognize that your current life once served a protective function, you create space for compassion. And compassion is what allows the nervous system to relax enough to consider new possibilities. Change that emerges from understanding rather than force is slower, but it is also far more sustainable. In the next part, we will explore what real choice actually looks like and why it has very little to do with dramatic decisions or external change, and everything to do with how you begin to relate differently to yourself from the inside out. One of the greatest misconceptions about change is the belief that choosing a different life begins with a big decision, a bold move, or a dramatic external shift. People imagine that at some point they will suddenly feel ready, confident, and certain, and that from that place they will finally take action, leave what no longer fits, and step into something new. But for most people who feel stuck, that moment never comes, and not because they are incapable, but because the premise itself is wrong. Real choice does not begin with action. It begins with a shift in relationship to yourself. When people try to change their lives by focusing only on external decisions, they often overlook the fact that their inner world remains organized around the same rules, fears, and loyalties as before. They may change jobs, relationships, or environments, but internally they continue to abandon themselves in subtle ways, repeating the same patterns in a different form. This is why many people experience a sense of disappointment after making a long-awaited change, realizing that the relief they expected never fully arrives. What actually keeps people stuck is not the absence of opportunity, but the presence of an internal contract they are still living by, often without realizing it. This contract usually formed early in life and contains unspoken rules such as don't be too much, don't need too much, don't disrupt, don't disappoint, and don't risk losing connection. As long as these rules remain active, every attempt at change will feel either unsafe or empty because the system is still prioritizing survival over truth. This is why forcing yourself into action often leads to exhaustion rather than liberation. Action that is not supported by inner permission becomes another form of self-abandonment, another way of pushing yourself beyond what feels safe, familiar, or allowed. For people who already learn to override their needs in order to belong, this kind of change simply reinforces the same old pattern under the guise of growth. Real choice begins much more quietly and much more subtly than most people expect. It begins the moment you stop arguing with your own experience and start taking it seriously. It begins when you acknowledge that feeling tired, disconnected, or unmotivated is not a personal failure, but a signal that something inside you has been living under pressure for a long time. It begins when you allow yourself to notice what drains you, what constricts you, and what feels heavy without immediately trying to fix or justify it. For many people, the most radical act is not changing their life, but stopping the internal dismissal of their own discomfort. They have become so accustomed to minimizing their feelings, rationalizing their dissatisfaction, or telling themselves they should be fine, that they no longer trust their inner signals. Rebuilding that trust is a prerequisite for any real change, because without it, every decision will be filtered through fear rather than self-connection. Another important shift happens when people realize that choosing themselves does not mean rejecting everything and everyone else. This binary thinking often keeps people stuck because it frames choice as an all-or-nothing act where self-loyalty automatically equals separation, conflict, or loss. In reality, choosing yourself begins internally, long before it becomes visible externally. It starts with how you speak to yourself, how you pace yourself, how you respond to your own limits, and whether you allow your needs to exist without immediately suppressing them. When this internal relationship begins to change, something subtle but powerful happens. The nervous system starts to experience a sense of safety that is not dependent on external approval or stability. This safety does not come from certainty or control, but from the felt experience of being on your own side. And when that safety grows, action no longer feels like a threat, but like a natural extension of inner alignment. This is also where many people realize that they don't actually need to know exactly what they want in order to begin choosing differently. The pressure to have a clear vision often paralyzes people, especially those who have spent much of their lives adapting to others. Instead of clarity, what is needed first is honesty. Honesty about what no longer fits, what feels dead, what feels draining, and what feels quietly suffocating. This kind of honesty is uncomfortable, but it is also grounding, because it brings you back into contact with your own lived experience. As this process unfolds, people often notice that their sense of stuckness begins to shift, not because their circumstances have changed, but because their internal position has. They stop forcing themselves forward and start listening more deeply, which paradoxically creates more movement, not less. The system begins to relax because it no longer feels pushed or ignored, and from that place, new impulses, desires, and directions can emerge organically. It is important to understand that this phase can feel slow and ambiguous, especially in a culture that values quick decisions and visible progress. But what looks like stagnation from the outside is often a period of profound internal reorganization. Old identities loosen, old rules lose their grip, and space is created for something new to form, even if it is not yet clear what that will be. In the final part, we will explore the most confronting and transformative question in this entire process. A question that does not demand an immediate answer, but invites a deeper alignment with yourself and with the life that is waiting beneath the one you learn to survive. There is a moment in this process that feels both unsettling and deeply clarifying. A moment where the focus shifts away from fixing your life and toward understanding it. It is not a moment of certainty or sudden confidence, but one of honesty, where you begin to sense that the life you are living is not wrong, but incomplete, not a failure, but a chapter that has reached its limit. This realization does not arrive dramatically. It often comes quietly, as a growing inability to ignore what no longer feels true. At this point, many people are tempted to ask themselves what they should do next, which direction they should choose, or how they can finally move forward. But those questions tend to pull the mind into problem-solving mode, searching for answers that the system is not yet ready to embody. There is a different question that matters far more at this stage, one that does not demand immediate action, but invites a deeper alignment. That question is this: whose life are you actually living? Not whose life do you want, or whose life do you dream of, But whose life are you currently organizing yourself around? Is it the life that once kept you safe? The life that earned you belonging? Or the life that allowed you to survive without being too exposed? Or is it a life that reflects who you are now, with the awareness, capacity, and self-connection you have developed over time? For many people, this question brings up discomfort because it reveals the extent to which their choices were shaped by fear rather than freedom. But it can also bring relief because it reframes stuckness not as a personal flaw, but as a sign that an old structure has outlived its purpose. You are not behind. You are simply standing at the edge of an identity that no longer fits. What often emerges here is a subtle but profound shift in responsibility. Instead of asking why life has not given you what you want, you begin to notice how often you have learned to abandon yourself in order to maintain stability, connection, or approval. This is not about blame or regret, but about awareness. Awareness that choice is not only something you do once, but something you live out every day in small, often invisible ways. Choosing yourself in this sense does not mean radically changing your circumstances overnight. It means noticing when you override your own limits, when you silence your needs, when you dismiss your own experience in order to keep things running smoothly. It means becoming aware of the moments where you leave yourself internally, even while everything looks fine on the outside. And it is in these moments that real choice begins to take shape. As this awareness deepens, many people notice a growing sense of inner tension, not because something is wrong, but because two truths are now present at the same time. One truth acknowledges that the life you built once made sense and deserves compassion. The other truth recognizes that continuing to live it without question is no longer possible. Holding both truths simultaneously can feel uncomfortable, but it is also a sign of maturity because it allows you to honor the past without being trapped by it. This is where patience becomes essential. When an old identity loosens, there is often a period of uncertainty where the new one has not yet fully formed. During this time, people may feel lost, unmotivated, or directionless, and they may interpret this as regression or failure. In reality, this in-between state is often a necessary pause, a space where the nervous system recalibrates and learns that it is no longer required to organize life around constant vigilance or self-suppression. Instead of forcing clarity, the invitation here is to cultivate safety from within. Safety that comes from listening rather than pushing, from respecting your own signals rather than overriding them, and from allowing yourself to move at a pace that feels sustainable rather than impressive. This kind of safety does not eliminate fear, but it reduces its power because fear no longer operates in isolation. It is held within a broader sense of self-trust. Over time, as this inner safety grows, something begins to shift naturally. Desires that once felt inaccessible start to feel less threatening. Boundaries that once felt impossible begin to feel necessary. And choices that once felt overwhelming start to feel inevitable, not because they are easy, but because they are aligned. Action, when it arises from this place, no longer feels like a leap into the unknown, but like a continuation of an inner truth that has already been acknowledged. The most important thing to understand is that choosing your life is not a single decision, but an ongoing relationship with yourself. A relationship where you learn to recognize when you are acting from fear rather than alignment, and where you gently, repeatedly choose to come back to yourself instead of abandoning what you feel. This process is rarely linear, and it often unfolds in quiet, almost invisible ways. But it is precisely this subtlety that makes it real. If your life feels stuck, it may not be asking you to push harder or figure everything out. It may be asking you to listen more closely, to recognize what this life once protected you from, and to allow yourself to grow beyond the structures that were built for survival rather than truth. And perhaps, for now, the only choice you need to make is to stop telling yourself that this is all there is. If this reflection resonated with you and you want to explore these themes more deeply, this space is here for that. This is where we talk about the inner movements that shape our lives long before we can name them, and where choosing yourself begins not with certainty, but with awareness.